Next Curve.
Welcome to another episode of Next Curve's Rethink podcast, where tech industry thought leaders discuss the trends and technologies that are shaping our digital future. And I'm Leonard Lee, Managing Director of Next Curve and also founder. And today I have our industry analyst friend and regular guest, Fung King Yu, joining me for a really interesting conversation about Rakuten. And it's great to have you again, Fung. Please take a moment to introduce yourself to those who are new to our audience.
Thanks very much, Leonard, for the kind words. And it's certainly great to be back on your podcast. It's always been a very entertaining and very engaging event. So as Leonard mentioned, I'm Fung. I'm based out of Singapore. I used to be attached with Gartner, and now I'm an independent analyst focusing on the communication service provider market, looking at the strategic trends, the business opportunities for the communication service providers. So that fundamentally includes their digital transformation, new opportunities like the IoT, edge computing, 5G, what are the associated business models, what are the disruptive trends out there, just so that, to help the communication service providers to navigate and to be successful in facing the numerous situations in the market right now.
Yes, and I think you're being way too humble. You are basically writing the leading pieces at Gartner on telco digital transformation and adjacent market opportunities. And I know because I used to use a lot of your work in the consulting work that I was doing at Gartner. So way too humble, but great to have you again. And so what we're going to be talking about is the big news this week. I mentioned Rakuten, and that is the big news, right? So Rakuten Mobile announced that their highly anticipated 5G network. That was, a rather fast follow-up to the launch of their network, their LTE network, in April of this year, right? And so we will be wrapping on this topic and sharing our thoughts and on this announcement as well as the launch. So there's going to be 4 things that we'll talk about. First, the thing that we're going to talk about is what is special about the Rakuten 5G strategy and rollout. And then we'll move on to what is the big deal about cloud native and 5G, because Tariq is always talking about that. And we'll talk about, is Rakuten Mobile just an MNO, or are they something more? And then we'll cap things off with what traditional operators can learn from Rakuten's 5G journey as it's been presented and as we know it. So before we dive in, though, impressions. I assume, Fung, that you watched the press event and probably read through the press material. What were your impressions about what was announced yesterday?
The thing that struck me, and I've always said this many times before, right? Rakuten is a new entrant in the Japanese market. And I've always said this, for any new entrant to succeed, right? When the rest of your competitors are zigging, you have to zag. You cannot be one of the many, in which case then you have no differentiation. You have no unique selling proposition. You have no differentiator. So what stands out, from Rakuten's perspective is that, it is a pioneer in cloud native infrastructure. So that changes the game quite significantly in the sense that, it has better flexibility, agility, and over the longer term, a better cost structure as well, which falls straight through to the profit margin, right? And it has also placed its bets on Open RAN. So new vendors with the idea of preventing the lock-in from the traditional vendors, of which there are 3 major ones, of course. So this is, I would say, a game-changing element in the mobile industry. Now, having said that, right, I wouldn't want to give the impression that it's all plain sailing, hunky-dory out there, it's all sunshine and roses out there for Rakuten, right? Because firstly, Open RAN is still in its infancy. There's a lot of testing, a lot of integration work, a lot of compliance issues as well that needs to be overcome. So arguably, Rakuten being a greenfield player with no legacy baggage, it is much easier for them to navigate through this maze as opposed to an incumbent mobile operator where some of them may have their RAN, their radio access network, where 3G, 4G, is already closely tied together, and that makes it very difficult for them to adopt Open RAN because of the nature of the hardware that they are using. Now with Rakuten, we have a clean sheet of paper. It's easier for them to move forward, right? They can just focus on the job at hand. Whereas for a legacy mobile operator, there's always the integration work that needs to be carried out in conjunction with the existing mobile networks. So it's not so easy for this second group of mobile operators. And secondly as well, one of the key challenges for Rakuten is that the Japanese mobile market is extremely competitive, and the consumers there are highly conscious of quality. So this is a very, very key factor there. So the performance of the mobile network has to be up to scratch and to meet the expectations of the Japanese consumer. If they can do that, if Rakuten can do that, then they will have a very, very good chance of succeeding. What struck me from the press release also is that Rakuten is not charging a price premium for 5G, the same price package as 4G, and that's arguably because they have yet to achieve nationwide coverage for 5G.
Well, yeah, and there's that, but then they also have a commitment at what they call a medium term to have, I think, something like 15 million subscribers. I don't know what midterm means, but that's their commitment to MIC, right? The Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications. And so, what do they say? I think one of the aspects of their offering is that for the first 3 million subscribers, they're providing the service for free, right? But obviously they haven't reached 3 million since their launch. And they've added about 1 million subscribers as of beginning of July. So they have a long way to go. And, quite honestly, I don't think 1 million ads is really that impressive considering the low price point that they've been offering, which is their unlimited 2.0 single
price or something that's the lead.
Yeah, it's like $28 US dollars, right? Or, about 3,000 yen. And yet, they're still struggling apparently to get subscribers to buy into the offers. And then, the other thing is, one of the things I thought was really interesting was in terms of customer satisfaction, they're like in the 80% range, which is really not that great. They did say that customer satisfaction was a priority, and it ties into what you just said. The expectation of the Japanese consumer or the mobile customer is high. And so that ties in with quality of service, that ties in with coverage. And those are important things that they need to continue to extend out. And, I guess one of the things that we can maybe give them as a pass is that this is a very new network. And they've been deploying their cell sites very rapidly. It's still early days, but I thought those were some interesting takeaways that I got from the press event.
It's clearly a journey, Leonard, right? And it's not a short journey. It's going to be a quite a long journey. And the incumbent entity, Docomo, still commands huge brand presence and market recognition. Yeah. And Rakuten really has to overcome that. And here's where your question about is Rakuten more than a mobile operator? And I would argue that they have to be more than a mobile operator in order to succeed against the big kahuna entity, Docomo, right? And here, that's where it gets interesting, right? Because Rakuten, from a group perspective, has a lot of interesting assets that they can bring to play, right? The platform business model. You have a platform, you have your customers, you can bring in third-party application developers, third-party companies, bring the buyers and sellers together. You be the manager of this platform, get data, gets the insights to drive more of the business. And Rakuten itself has very interesting assets as well, right?
Yeah.
E-commerce
Yeah.
space,
Right.
Payments,
Yeah.
gaming,
Yeah.
which makes for a very interesting mix. Now, if they can execute well on this, right, it could be a very promising game changer.
They're the classic UTB or under the bottom player, right? They're not a traditional player. Their core business is, like you said, e-commerce, and they can use that as a subsidy engine to finance this investment in a new network, right? And so they can do what they're doing, which is provide, a year subscription to their mobile services to 3 million customers. What new entrants are positioned to be able to do that type of thing other than, a company like Rakuten that has another high margin business that they can use to fund this kind of very bold initiative. And there has to be something bigger in terms of a return and a benefit than just the traditional comms game business, the margins and everything else, right?
I believe the comms element, right, is just part of the bigger picture, one piece of the jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah. Yeah. And so let's talk specifically about their 5G strategy and their rollout and what's special about it. And you've kind of touched on a few things here already. One of them, you mentioned the open standard or their focus on ORAN and seemingly co-designing and co-creating a lot of the technology. I mean, they say that it's open, but then you'll hear Tariq oftentimes talk about, well, we designed or we worked with XYZ to develop our own equipment, right? So these small cells, femto cells, and massive MIMO antennas that they're deploying are actually designs that they developed together with the likes of NEC and Alito. They've been working with Mavenir. So it's almost like they are taking a bit more of a stake in the technology and being part of the innovation at the technological level. So, in somewhat in a way, it's a little bit hands off, but in a way, kind of doing what the old school telcos used to do, where they were driving the technology and the innovation at the infrastructure level, right?
I think a few things here, right? So let's touch on the word open for a start, right? And every time when I meet vendors or the participants in the industry, I always ask this question, right? What do you mean by open?
Yeah.
It's subject to interpretation, right?
Right.
And frequently the answer is not a binary one, right? On one hand, you have truly open, and on the other hand, truly proprietary. What I've come across from my own experience is that the word openness is always a spectrum.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
depending on the interpretation and the perspective, right? So any mobile operator out there in the market needs to do their due diligence, right, as to what is meant truly open, because every player out there will always inject their own secret sauce, their own adaptations, will result in that spectrum of openness. So that's why the effort for compliance and testing is indispensable. Right.
Well, like Android, right? Android is open, but you have so many forks and variations.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So everyone has to do their due diligence on this aspect, and hopefully, the fragmentation of the Open RAN ecosystem does not happen, right? Because that would be a terrible thing, right? So the more adherence to the open philosophy and the standards, so much better for Parallel Wireless, Altiostar, and Mavenir. Now the second thing about Rakuten, which is quite interesting, is they're trying to create their own Rakuten communications platform, and they try to sell that to other mobile operators, right?
Yeah.
Now, this is interesting, and I tend to be less optimistic on this point, because from what I've observed of communication service providers in the past and also today, right, not many comm service providers are willing to buy a platform, an operating platform, from a fellow communication service provider. Because firstly, they have no sense of how committed the seller is to the long-term sustainability and the future roadmap of this platform, right? That's one, that's one thing. And then is it as good, or maybe better than what's out there from the pure vendors who are focusing in this space.
Yeah.
Right. So there is that question mark there. Although I think there are one or two comm service providers who have sort of like decided to adopt Rakuten's platform.
Well,
but there's still some surrounding this.
Yeah, and I describe that play as Rakuten's attempt to be some form of red hat for ORAN, right? Like you were saying, there's varying degrees and different levels of open for open technology, but at the end of the day, what operators are going to need, traditional operators, they look for integrated system just because they want, number one throat to choke. As much as the open community thinks that having a number of players in the marketplace, having the best breed of, a specific component of the overall RAN architecture is a good thing, it's not necessarily the case, right? You always have to have somebody that's integrating this stuff together. And like you said, testing it, making sure that it's compliant, but probably more importantly, optimizing. And if you have, and it's inevitable that there's going to be fragmentation, because that, fragmentation happens due to competitive pressures within many open ecosystems. And, that's why you have Red Hat. Red Hat, if you really look at that company and what they've done with Linux, there's a lot of proprietary stuff that they've added on top of the base Linux to make it enterprise class. Now, ORAN is not intrinsically, in terms of a technology implementation, carrier grade, right? You need to get technology companies that build on top of the standard to make it carrier grade. And so it's going to be interesting to see how and if Rakuten can pull it off. But I think one of the opportunities that they have is definitely with some potential greenfield players. I mean, Dish Network, for instance, right? I mean, that's a perfect example. And if you look in developing markets, there are tons of opportunities, I think, for a red hat of Open RAN to go in and then present a competitive offering. But I think there's a number of myths related to open. A lot of folks think that it's cheaper, it's more cost efficient or better, but that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, it may not, because the integration costs, so on and so forth, and other hidden costs as well. And so it depends on who you are.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly. And so let's move on to cloud native, because, Tariq always talks about it, is a big part of their 5G play. Obviously, they rolled out 5G NSA infrastructure, and I think it's in Q2 of 2021 where I think they're planning on making the transition to standalone. But he's always talking about cloud native. Now, what were some of your thoughts there? Because he did have an opportunity to get up on stage and kind of make a spiel about the unique Rakuten 5G journey.
This is a very interesting topic. And again, we see a spectrum of comm service providers in terms of their attitudes towards cloud native. So players like Rakuten, greenfield, they can go in one single bound or one single leap and move straight to a cloud native architecture, right?
Yeah.
For our typical comm service provider, they have the legacy systems and infrastructure. So the solution becomes more complex. Do they want to go on a big bang approach as well, complete transformation? Or do they want to go on a phased approach, right? Phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, to mitigate the risk and to better manage the challenges? Or do they just want to focus on challenges? Or do they just want to focus on a niche? So let's say, what I mean by this is, let's say you are a global CSP, or a CSP in a huge market. You may want to limit it to a certain subsidiary or certain operating unit and contain that, right? So to better manage the cost. So that's one perspective of cloud native, right? The other perspective is, right, what are CSPs doing right now today? A lot of the CSPs are now just at the stage of getting their infrastructure to be cloud ready, right? Ready to be ported to to containers, so on and so forth, and that's primarily driven by the cost reduction or operational efficiency dictate, right? As opposed to truly having the apps and the OS on a cloud infrastructure. So again, here we see many different flavors.
Yeah.
But one thing is clear to me: the migration towards the cloud. Some call it the telco cloud.
Mhm.
It's real, and there are many CSPs on different speeds and on different
Yeah.
positions in terms of their migration towards the end goal. But clearly, that is the trend moving forward for the next few years, and it's probably driven also by the advent of 5G. To truly capture the true potential of 5G, you need all these cloud capabilities as well.
It is going to be a tough journey for a lot of the incumbent or traditional players because, I mean, all we have to do is look at the challenges that enterprises have with their cloud migrations. As much as cloud has been hyped, if you look at the workloads that are in the cloud, I'll bet you that most of the workloads are commodity workloads, the Netflix running their, media delivery platform or, some other type of large massive commodity workloads, and then maybe a fraction of those will be the mission critical business applications, and I'm talking primarily from a infrastructure perspective, right? But let's be honest, even on the enterprise side there's still a lot of on-prem stuff, and now we have this realization that hybrid cloud is really what is going to be the reality going forward, that you have to deal with these legacy assets that will probably not go away for quite some time. They still work. There's still assets that can be sweated. Sweated, is that like a term? and so, yeah. So they're going to have a different type of decision criteria that they're working with versus the green field. And so here's the thing about cloud native. I think Tariq brings organization up quite a bit when he talks about cloud native. Maybe that's one of the things that he's really honing in on as a differentiator, because if you're dealing with a lot of legacy stuff in your portfolio as a traditional operator, it's really hard for you to make that transition into a web scale operation, right? Where you're using agile and DevOps to test and develop, test, and then quickly deploy through a quote unquote continuous release process new services, right? Cloud native is not necessarily unique to what Rakuten's doing, right? I mean, if you look at what Ericsson's doing, Nokia's doing, Huawei's doing, these guys are all over cloud native as well, right? And so their platforms are
everyone's beating the same drums, singing from the same song sheet.
Right. And so as much as Rakuten tries to portray themselves as being cloud native, the ORAN ecosystem that he's building and the cloud native infrastructure he's building out is not necessarily a unique thing in terms of a technology set, and being uniquely cloud native.
I think the key thing here, right? I mean, you brought up the word ecosystem, right? I think that is very, very important, right? Because one can truly differentiate through one's ecosystem, right? So the choice and selection of partners, the ability to pull all these different capabilities and resources together is a very critical skill. For any mobile communication service provider out there, without which, right, they would struggle. The alignment of the partners, ensuring that the shared vision, the trust element as well. And once that is set up, and once the comm service provider had decided to go on this cloud native journey, right, that's the easy part, to make that decision, go or no go. That's the easy part. Relatively easy. The hard part is this, right? Once you have decided to embark on a cloud native journey, the bulk of the challenges or issues pertains to the organization, the culture, the mindset, and the ability to execute. And let's face it, right? Once comm service provider decides to go cloud native, you're talking about a lot of automation, a lot of new skills, a lot of new capabilities. This strikes fear and uncertainty and the existing workforce within the comm service provider organization. And this has to be addressed because
Yeah.
if not, right, it can be a resistance to the momentum to change.
Right.
And this is really the hard part. And that's where, the leadership, the quality of management,
Right.
right, and to have the plan to retrain, reskill, redeploy, it's
Yeah.
critical.
Oh yeah,
Right?
yeah. I never imagined that we'd be talking about HR issues
Really,
or
it's
human
closely
resource
involved.
development. Yeah.
When we talk
Oh
cloud
yeah.
native and all these digital transformation initiatives, right? I see three gears. The technology gear,
Yeah.
relatively simple, right? You can go to the best vendors out there and
Yeah.
procure the hardware, right? And then there's the processes part.
Yeah.
You gotta change your processes. Things like minimum viable product, agile IT, DevOps, etc., etc. How do you incorporate man-machine interfaces? How do you get the employees to work side by side with an AI
Yeah.
who
Yeah.
keeps telling you that you're wrong? You need to do it this way and not that way.
Yeah.
A lot of human-related issues there, right? And the third gear is the people aspect. So these gears have to work in harmony.
Yeah. Yeah.
One of those gears are misaligned or not in place, the whole edifice, I think, will collapse.
Yeah, and the tricky part is it's always a continuum of change, and it's very difficult to orchestrate that change. And I think that's the big challenge. And so, getting to what traditional operators can learn from the Rakuten 5G journey, I think maybe that's one of the things that they probably can't learn much about from Rakuten is how they need to deal with the transformation they need to go through, right? And I hear and read a lot in industry press about how Rakuten is an example of what carriers need to do, but it's actually more of an example of what they probably need to be, right? But the journey, the transformation that the traditional telcos have to make is very different than the greenfield journey that Rakuten has made.
I would be very careful, right, in terms of giving advice to other mobile communication service providers. Like in the common press or media, they always put up Rakuten as the poster boy.
Yeah.
This is how things should be done. It's too simplistic.
Oh yeah.
Let's be honest about it. It's just too simplistic. We have to consider the context. The context of Rakuten within the Japanese mobile communications market,
Yeah.
within the context of Rakuten's capabilities, resources, and leadership,
Yeah.
right? And other CSPs may not necessarily have the same conditions, or maybe even the same market dynamics. So it's
right.
very hard to say that follow Rakuten wholesale. It's wrong. It's a wrong advice to give the mobile CSPs.
Yeah, and think about where they're launching their 5G network, and probably the best place on earth to launch a 5G network, especially millimeter wave, which is Tokyo. Highly dense, massive, and wonderful economics, right?
The Shibuya crossing, right?
Yeah,
I don't know how many thousands of people cross every minute.
It's like 2 million or some crazy thing like that. Or, and everyone is mobile. They're not stuck in their cars. They're in a subway. I don't know about now. I mean, they should be masked up and probably staying at home, given the COVID situation. But in a non-COVID era, they would be in the subway walking around, and they would have their handsets, and they would be doing something. They'd be actively using mobile computing. You're absolutely right. Context is important. And to assume that you can replicate whatever degree of success that you might consider Rakuten to have had thus far is naive.
It is, but unfortunately, right, when I talk to a lot of the comm service providers, one of the most frequent questions is, what are the leaders doing?
Yeah.
Because they want to copy, they want to imitate, they want to emulate, without seriously considering the contextual situation.
Right.
And that's where it's a recipe for failure.
Yeah, and their own readiness, right? Their readiness,
Yeah,
the context and their readiness to actually make the change, which is oftentimes the most important thing to consider before you embark on a
my
transformation.
advice, for the mobile comm service providers is, yes, look very closely at what Rakuten is doing, right? The ecosystem that they're building, try to understand their strategy and their vision and their operating philosophies, so on and so forth. But at the same time, to understand the context and the nature of the Japanese market and the wider Rakuten organizations capabilities and resources as well, because somebody else might not have the same setup.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe another thing that traditional operators could learn is that one thing that Rakuten seems to have done is proven at least ORAN based technologies and infrastructure are possible and viable. Are they the best? That's still out. The jury's still out on that. But yeah.
Yep. Sorry. Go ahead.
No. I was just going to say, because prior to what Rakuten has done, it was still a question of whether or not you can actually build a network using ORAN. And they've kind of answered that question. And so that's one takeaway. And, it's not to sit there and say that operators are going to go and start to engage Rakuten and their ecosystems to build out their network based on ORAN. But what I'm saying is that, they can now consider ORAN as being something that works, but it may not be the best. That's still to be determined.
My position is I'm probably more optimistic here, right? I believe Open RAN is here to stay, right? It is still in its infancy stages, but it is a classic disruptive technology in the purest of Clayton Christensen's sense, from the book The Innovator's Dilemma, right? It is, from a performance perspective, maybe it's still not as good as the proprietary systems being sold by the major incumbent vendors, right? But here's the rub, right? It will improve and progress over time and narrow the performance gap at some point in the future and potentially overtake it.
Yeah.
It is, I feel it's going to be a classic disruptive technology dynamic.
Well, here's the other thing to consider here, though, Fung, is that, when you really think about what ORAN is, it's an interoperability framework, right? It specifies interfaces and service definitions that are common, that they're trying to set as standards. The likes of Nokia, Huawei, Ericsson, they can easily expose a lot of their stuff, their stack, at different levels to talk to these different interfaces. And although, that would be an evolution of what they are doing today, it doesn't preclude the traditional telco tech providers from playing the ORAN game. In a lot of ways, ORAN is an internal architectural decision by the CTO of the operator, and then you have the technologies that comply with it. Operator who doesn't subscribe to the ORAN, philosophy, if you will, there's no space for the ORAN tech players.
I think again here is the classic disruptive technology narrative, right? I mean, you mentioned the incumbent vendors, right? Now they have the existing customers to think about, so it's not so simple for them to just say, okay, I'm going to adopt Open RAN tomorrow, right? That's the baggage that they have. And arguably, Open RAN is not as profitable as a proprietary hardware solution, right? So the thing for all these big vendors to think about is, if you're the CEO, for example, right?
Yeah.
You will be thinking just one question. what will be the impact on my share price tomorrow? Big problem there,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So that is why it is difficult for incumbent players to embrace disruptive technologies. Again, classic Clayton Christensen dynamic at play here. But having said that, right, I think Nokia has taken the plunge. It has openly decided to move there, and I think kudos to them for taking the plunge.
Well, here's the thing. I'm not as big of a fan of the whole disruption theory as everyone else is. Here's the thing. Vertical integration is also a differentiated play, and that's what the traditional guys have. And at the end of the day, the winner of ORAN is going to be someone who goes to market with an integrated stack that's optimized. And so, I think that's the other thing that the industry should be conscious of. And why open oftentimes doesn't mean a democratization of the technology. Eventually, you have defragmentation of the market space. We have a lot of fragmentation today in terms of players. But eventually, it's going to be consolidated into a few players who know how to deliver on the integrated stack and provide that one throat to choke. And
so I think great play for the systems integrators. Great play for players like Red Hat, for example. Right?
As long as they don't charge too much. Well, you know what I'm saying.
But I think that's also a further driver for this Open RAN dynamic, right? And it has to do with the politics and Huawei as well.
Yeah.
Right?
Big time.
Locked out of the market. A lot of the CSPs are terrified by having less choice out there in the market, which is why Samsung and NEC are making progress in markets outside of their home market. They are terrified of the CSPs are terrified of the lack of choices and the lack of bargaining power, and then having to pay more potentially, right? Because once the bargaining power shifts to the vendors, the pricing arrangements would change as well. Which is why there is the momentum behind Open RAN. Many of the major comm service providers want to see it happen, and they want to see it succeed.
Right. But like you said, early days.
Early days.
ORAN. Yeah, even though I think Rakuten has done ORAN a great service, and as have their partner companies, right? And so, hey, Fung, great to have you again. I think that's about all the time we have for this episode. So thanks for joining me on this talking about this very exciting event, and take a moment to let our audience know how to get in touch with you.
Right. Thanks, Leonard. Again, like I said, always very interesting to chat with you on this interesting topic. And of course, it's still early days. So both of us, we are keeping our eyes peeled on the market and how the dynamics will shift and develop in the future. So for listeners who want to get more information or get in touch with me, you can contact me through my LinkedIn profile anytime. So thanks very much, Leonard.
Absolutely. And to our listeners and viewers, thanks for joining us. Please subscribe to our YouTube and Apple Podcast channels. Search for NextCurve and it should pop up. And visit us at www.next-curve.com. And until next time, be safe and stay healthy. Thanks a lot, Fung. We'll see you again next time. Okay?
Bye. See ya.
Cheers.
Visit us at www.next-curve.com.